Hare Krishna, peace of memorable obeisances, glories to Prabhupada. So we are continuing our discussion on the 13th chapter and we will resume from verse 17. Avibhaktam cha bhuteshu vibhaktam eva cha sthitam bhuta bhartra cha tajkeyam grashishnu prabhavishnu cha. Although the Supersoul appears to be divided among all beings, he is never divided. He is situated as one. Although he is the maintainer of every living entity, it is to be understood that he devours and develops all. So, some more discussion about the seemingly contradictory features of the Supersoul. That even though he is one, he appears to be divided. So, two ways to understand this, that the Supersoul is non-different from Krishna, who is one, but the Supersoul also divides to accompany each and every jiva in the body. So, the Vedas give the example of the sun, that the sun is one in the sky, but its effect is experienced everywhere. So, similarly, Krishna is one, but as the Supersoul, he appears to be divided amongst everyone. And the one and divided is also in terms of cause and effect. That he is the singular cause, but the effect is the creation of the unlimited aspects of creation, especially the unlimited jivas. Then it is mentioned that he is the maintainer and he also destroys them. So Krishna as the Vishnus, the Mahavishnu, the Garbhodaksha Vishnu, Kshodaksha Vishnu, he creates and maintains everyone. And then Krishna, in terms of his Kali Shakti, he is also destroying. So in the 11th chapter, we saw how Krishna appeared as the Kal Roop and where he was devouring the entire creation. So in one form he is creating and in another form he is destroying. Okay, next verse. Verse 18. Jyotisham api tajyotis tamasa param uchyate jnanam geyam jnanagamyam hridi sarvasya vishtitam. He is the source of light in all luminous objects. He is beyond the darkness of matter and is unmanifested. He is knowledge. He is the object of knowledge and he is the goal of knowledge. He is situated in everyone's heart. So Krishna ends the description of the Paramatma by giving a brief summary of the qualities. So he is the source of all light. So from the Paramatma comes the Brahmajyoti. And the Brahmajyoti, which is blocked in the material world by the Mahatattva, there he appears as Jyotisham. He appears as the luminaries like the sun. So whether within or outside the material world, he is the source of illumination. He is Jnanam, knowledge. Geyam is the object of knowledge and he is Jnanagamyam, which means that he can only be approached by those in knowledge. So even though the Supersoul is so intimately and closely associated with the material world, he is beyond Prakriti. So just like the sun is never touched by darkness, he is never touched by Prakriti. So we can understand that all this preceding set of verses were description of the Supersoul and not the soul. Because these qualities of sustaining everyone, creating and destroying, cannot be attributed to the soul. Okay, let's go to the next verse. Iti kshetram tatha jnanam geyam choktam samasatah madbhaktaye tadvigyaya madbhavayopapadyate. Thus, the field of activities, the body, knowledge, and the knowable have been summarily described by me. Only my devotees can understand this thoroughly and thus attain to my nature. So, this is Krishna reflecting on what he has taught Arjuna so far. So, he has answered 3 of the questions of Arjuna. That what is the kshetra, the field of activities? What is the kshetragya, which is the knower of the field of activities? What is gyam, which is the knowable? And what is gyan, which is knowledge? So 4 of the questions he has answered. And then he also gives the qualifications of one to understand this. So he says, Mad bhakta etad vigyaya, that only my devotees can understand this. So this is interesting because Krishna is speaking about Sankhya. Right? He's speaking about the analytical composition of the material world and how it binds the jiva. But then he says that Mad bhakta etad vigyaya. Now, one can say that even the jnanis can understand it. But Krishna says vigyaya. So vigyaya means that they can actually realize it. So there's a difference between understanding something, gyan, and realizing something, which is vigyan. So by gyan, one can know something. Like most of us know that we are not the body, but the soul. But vigyan means that you act on that knowledge, that the knowledge is realized, that at every moment you're acting on the platform that you're not the body but the soul, which is a much more advanced and a difficult platform. So the jnanis, through Sankhya, they may understand all these compositions of the world, but only the devotees can realize it. And then what is the result of it? He says, Mad bhavayo papadyate, that after realizing this, the devotees can attain my nature. So essentially, when one understands the nature of the bondage, then one can free themselves from that, and thus one can go back to their spiritual identity. Next verse. Okay, verse 20. Prakritim purusham cheva vidyanadi ubhavapi vikarams cha gunams cheva vidhi prakriti sambhavan. Material nature and the living entities should be understood to be beginningless. Their transformations and the modes of matter are products of material nature. So, beginning from this verse, for the next 8 verses, from 20 to 27, Krishna will answer the first 2 questions asked by Arjuna about Purush and Prakriti. So, Purush literally means enjoyer, and Prakriti means enjoyed. So, Purusha refers to both Jiva and Krishna because they are both enjoyers. The Jiva is trying to enjoy materially, and Krishna is the original supreme enjoyer. So this verse is understood to refer to the Jiva, and Krishna makes 2 important points over here. First he says is that both Prakriti and Purusha here is Jiva, so both Prakriti and Jiva are eternal. They are without a beginning and without an end. The Prakriti is, even though it's constantly changing. So one might say, how can you say that matter is eternal when the universes are created and destroyed and they're going through so many transformations? So even though Prakriti is constantly changing, but in that form of change, it is eternal. So since they are both eternal, their association is also going on since time immemorial. So the association of Prakriti and Purush, of Jiva and material nature, has been going on since the beginning of time, or there is no one time where you can say that this is when the Jiva started to associate with Prakriti. So this essentially Krishna is talking about the Nityabaddhas, Jivas like us who have been eternally associating with Prakriti or material nature in the Purusha mood, in the mood of enjoyment. The second point is that even though they have been associating since time immemorial, there is still a difference. That while Prakriti is constantly changing, the Jiva does not change. All the changes that are seen are the result of the association of the Jiva with the Prakriti. So the analogy that is given is that if there is a tree that is next to a river, then the reflection of the tree will appear to shimmer as the water moves. But that does not mean that the tree is moving. It's the water that is moving that's causing the reflection to flicker. So the Jiva is eternally situated in his Swarup as Sachitananda, as the servant of Krishna. That never changes. But what changes is the manifestation of the association of the Jiva with material nature. And later on in the very next chapter, we'll see how when the Jiva associates with the modes, sometimes they will become animals, sometimes plants, sometimes demigods. But that is essentially the result of the association of the Jiva with Prakriti. Okay, so let's move on to the next verse. Verse 21. Karikaran kratvate hetu prakriti ruchyate purusha sukha dukkhanam bhoktrvate hetu ruchyate. Nature is said to be the cause of all material causes and effects, whereas the living entity is the cause of the various sufferings and enjoyments in this world. So this is a very interesting verse because it kind of allocates responsibilities to it divides the accountability between the Jiva and Prakriti. So the previous verse mentioned how the Jiva and Prakriti have been closely associated since time immemorial. Now, what is the nature of that association? What is the result of it is explained in this verse. So what does Prakriti do? The Prakriti is the cause of the material transformations. So because of the influence of Prakriti, a particular kind of body is given to a soul. That body has a certain ability to enjoy and suffer. All this is done by Prakriti. Then when the Jiva occupies that body, then he either decides to enjoy or suffer. That is up to the Jiva. So Prabhupada in the purport writes that once placed in some particular kind of body, he comes under the control of the nature of that body, being matter, acts according to the laws of nature. At the time, the living entity has no power to change that law. Supposing an entity is put in the body of a dog, As soon as put in the body of a dog, he must act like a dog. He cannot act otherwise. And if the living entity is put in the body of a hog, then he is forced to eat stool and act like a hog. Similarly, if the living entity is put in the body of a demigod, he must act according to his body. This is the law of nature. Right? So very nicely Prabhupada explains the relationship between the two. Now the body of a dog or a hog or a demigod, they're all the products of Prakriti, because they're essentially made of those 24 elements that we spoke about earlier on. But when the jiva, out of its own free will, decides to occupy a certain kind of body, then the jiva will enjoy or suffer according to the nature of that body. So Krishna is not forcing the jiva into the body of a dog or a hog or a demigod. That is jiva's own desire. In the 8th chapter we studied that based on one's karma and based on one's desire, the jiva gets a particular kind of body. That is the jiva's choice. But once the jiva gets that body, then he becomes conditioned by the nature of the body. That for an hog, eating stool is pleasurable. So that is the source of pleasure for the jiva in the body of a hog. For a demigod, it is abominable. So that is the source of suffering for a demigod. Same jiva, but has now become conditioned by the nature of the body. So this also helps us understand about who is the doer. So at different points, Krishna attributes the doership to different entities. At one point he says Prakriti Kriyamanani Guna Karmani Sarvasha, that everything is being done by Prakriti, the modes of material nature. But then Krishna also attributes the doership to the jiva. If not, then what was the point in Bhagavad-gita? Because Prakriti cannot read Bhagavad-gita. Prakriti is inert. Only the jiva can read Bhagavad-gita. So if the jiva has no ability to change, then why give spiritual instructions? But now in these verses, Krishna is explaining how this relationship comes to manifest. That the jiva has the position of the enjoyer of happiness and distress that is produced by Prakriti. And the jiva is also the cause of the connection with this particular form of a particular form of Prakriti. Okay, next verse. Verse 22. Purusha prakritisto hi bhunkte prakriti jan gunan karanam guna sangasya sadasatyo nijanmashu. The living entity in material nature thus follows the ways of life, enjoying the three modes of nature. This is due to his association with that material nature. Thus he meets with good and evil among various species. So this is an elaboration on the previous verse, which said that the living entity is the cause of various suffering and enjoyment. So one might ask that why should any living entity desire suffering? And the understanding is that the suffering is an unintended consequence of the jiva's misguided pursuit for enjoyment. So the example is that somebody might enjoy eating meat. So in that pursuit of enjoyment, the jiva then commits violence, kills other living entities, and because of that is condemned to suffering. So the enjoyment is this desire for misguided enjoyment is a consequence of the identification with the material body and senses that is created by Prakriti. But Prakriti is not the cause of the happiness and distress. It is the jiva. Prakriti is simply providing the means for it. It is the jiva that is out of its own free will exploiting and choosing to adopt the means for either happiness or suffering. So this verse is very important because it describes how the living entity, who is the Kshetragya, that who is the knower of the Kshetra, he gets trapped within the Kshetra. So even though he is the lord of the Kshetra, he is nevertheless trapped by the Kshetra. And the reason is sadasad yoni janmasho, that because of their desire to materially enjoy, they take shelter in sadasad yoni, in higher or lower species. And because of that, they have different kinds of enjoyment and suffering. And this identification will go on until the jiva takes to the path of bhakti and becomes liberated. So the verse makes clear that it is the jiva alone that is responsible for its enjoyment and suffering, not Prakriti. Prakriti is simply providing the means by which the jiva can either enjoy or suffer. Okay, let's go to the next verse. Verse 23. Updrashtatman Updrashtanumanta cha Bharta Bhokta Maheshwara Paramatmeti Chapyukto Desmin Purusha Para. Yet in this body there is another, a transcendental enjoyer, who is the Lord, the Supreme Proprietor, who exists as the overseer and permitter, and who is known as the Super Soul. So in the previous verses, Krishna was speaking about the jiva or the soul as one of the Purushas. Right? Arjuna had asked Krishna, who is the enjoyers, who are the Purushas? And Krishna is saying there are two Purushas. There is the jiva and there is the Paramatma. So previously I had spoken about the jiva, that how the jiva is trying to enjoy with the material nature, trying to lord it over material nature. Here he speaks about that there is another Purusha, but he makes the distinction that this is the transcendental enjoyer. He is the Lord, the Supreme Proprietor. So this is the Paramatma over here. So Krishna not only talks about the other enjoyer, he also talks about the relationship between the two enjoyers. So one is trying to enjoy and the other one is permitting the other to enjoy. So Bharta Bhokta Maheshwara. So he is, what are the roles that the Super Soul plays? He is Updrashta. He is the overseer. Anumanta. He is the permitter. Then he is the Bharta. He is the master. Bhokta, he is the supreme enjoyer. And the Maheshwara is the supreme Lord. So the relationship between the soul and the super soul, Prabhupada explains very nicely in the purport. I'll read from it. The living entity can be situated either in the material energy or in the spiritual energy. As long as is conditioned by the material energy, the Supreme Lord, as his friend, the super soul stays with him just to get him to return to the spiritual energy. The Lord is always eager to take him back to the spiritual energy, but due to his minute independence, the individual entity is continually rejecting the association of spiritual light. This misuse of independence is the cause of his material strife and in the conditioned nature. So, this is how the two Purushas are relating to one another. There is one Purusha which is the Jiva, which has minute independence, that is trying to exploit the material energy for its own apparent happiness that ultimately results in distress. And there is the Super Soul, which is non-different from the Supreme Lord, that actually has accompanied the Jiva to satisfy all his desires, material or spiritual. So one might say that if the Paramatma is indeed the well-wisher, then why does it allow the Jiva to perform sinful activities, knowing that they are detrimental to the Jiva? And Prabhupada gives the answer, because of the free will of the Jiva. Krishna does not interfere with the free will. So when the Jiva chooses to misuse their free will and perform sinful activities, then the Paramatma simply acts as the permitter. He says, okay, you have the qualification to do this, so you can do it and you can suffer the result of it also. And conversely, when the Jiva is anxious to perform devotional service, then the Paramatma also helps the Jiva make progress. Okay, let's go to the next verse. Verse 24. Yaevam veti purusham prakritim cha gunay saha sarvata vartamanopi nasabhuyo bhijayate. One who understands this philosophy concerning material nature, the living entity, and the interaction of the modes of nature is sure to attain liberation. He will not take birth here again, regardless of his present position. So Krishna has explained the two Purushas. He has explained Jiva and the Paramatma. Krishna has also explained Prakriti. So in doing so, Krishna has explained his own position as the Supreme, the Permitter, the cause of all causes. Also explained the position of how the Jiva becomes conditioned by the material nature. So when one understands all this, then the person will no longer allow himself to be entangled by material nature. So if one is tied with a rope, then one may push and pull their hands, but the rope will just become tighter and tighter. But if somebody tells them that this is how the knot is tied, then the person can follow the strands of the rope and expertly untie that knot. So Prabhupada says that a clear understanding of the material nature, the super soul, the individual soul and their interrelation makes one eligible to become liberated and return to the spiritual atmosphere without being forced to return to this material nature. Right? And Krishna makes this point that this happens regardless of his present position. So anyone and everyone is qualified to take to this process and attain liberation. Next verse. Verse 25. Dhyanena atmani pashyanti kechid atmanam atmana anya sankhyena yogena karma yogena chapare. Some perceive the super soul within themselves through meditation, others through the cultivation of knowledge, and still others through working without fruitive desires. So in the previous verse, Krishna had explained how if one understands the self, the Paramatma, the material modes of material nature, they can be liberated. Now in two verses, 25 and 26, Krishna is talking about how can one know him, Purusha. And he focuses on that because essentially that is the fountainhead of all other realizations. If one knows Krishna, one will automatically know the modes of material nature, one will know the self. The example that is given is when the sun rises, then everything is illuminated, including the sun. So three things can be seen: the sun, the self, and everything around oneself. Similarly, when one becomes Krishna conscious, then one understands Krishna, one understands self, and one understands Prakriti. So Krishna is saying, how can one perceive the super souls? So he gives three ways over here. So he says through meditation, which is through Astang Yoga. Then he says through cultivation of knowledge, which is Gyan. And then he says through working without fruitive desires, which is Nishkam Karma. So all these processes eventually lead to the knowledge of Krishna. That through Nishkam Karma one gets Atma Gyan, and then based on that one cultivates knowledge. So by the cultivation of knowledge one begins to understand Brahman, and then one performs meditation and one begins to understand the nature of Paramatma. Next verse. Verse 26. Anyatu evam ajananta Shrutva nebhya upasate tepi chaitidryantyeva mrityum shruti parayanaha. Again, there are those who, although not conversant in spiritual knowledge, begin to worship the Supreme Person upon hearing about Him from others. Because of their tendency to hear from authorities, they transcend the path of birth and death. So in the previous verse, Krishna talked about three methods which have fairly rigorous. Nishkam Karma, Gyan and Astang require control of the senses, then detaching it from the objects, control of desires. Now in this verse, Krishna is saying that there are those who are not able to do this. So not conversant means either they are not able to do it or they are not inclined to do it. So what is the path for them? Shravanam. So upon hearing about the Lord from others. So this is the path of the devotees. So of the 9 angas of bhakti, Shravana, Kirtana, Smarana, Vandanam. So Shravan is the basis. That when they hear from others about the position of the Lord, His pastimes, how He is the bestower of liberation, then they develop that realization that comes to the others after following the difficult path of Karam, Gyan or Astha. So Prabhupada says that this verse is particularly applicable to modern society, because in modern society there is practically no education in spiritual matters. Some of the people may appear to be atheistic or agnostic or philosophical, but actually there is no knowledge of philosophy. As for the common man, if he is a good soul, then there is a chance for advancement by hearing. This hearing process is very important. Lord Chaitanya, who preached Krishna consciousness in the modern world, gave great stress to hearing, because if common man simply hears from authoritative sources, he can make process, especially according to Lord Chaitanya, if he hears the transcendental vibration of Hare Krishna. So with this verse, Krishna has completed his answers to the 6 questions that Arjun had asked. So we will quickly go over the 6 questions and the corresponding answers given by Krishna. So here we see in this table the list of the questions asked by Arjun and then the answers that have been given by Krishna. So the first question asked by Arjun is, what is Kshetra? What is the field of activities? Krishna answered that in verse 2 and then in verses 6 to 7. And he says that the material body of the embodied soul is the Kshetra. And the Kshetra or the material body is composed of the 24 elements. Now interesting to note that the Kshetra is also Prakriti. So the 6th question by Arjun, what is Prakriti, also points back to Kshetra, because the material body is composed of the 24 elements, but it is also composed of the modes of material nature. So this is the answer to what is Kshetra. The second question is, who is the knower of the field? Kshetragya. And Krishna gives the answer that the Jiva and the Paramatma. The third question is, what is knowledge? Jnanam. The answer to that is in verses 8 to 12, that knowledge is understanding the difference between the two Kshetragyas, between Jiva and Paramatma, and also understanding the relationship between the Jiva and the Paramatma, and between the Jiva and the body, and between the Paramatma and the body. Right? So three entities have been described, Jiva, Paramatma and the body. And how the three interrelate with one another, that is knowledge. So in verses 8 to 12, Krishna talks about the qualities that one should aspire to develop to acquire this knowledge, or the qualities that manifest in one who has that knowledge. The fourth question is Gyam. What is the object of knowledge? So this is answered in verses 13 to 18, where Krishna says that the two Kshetragyas are the object of knowledge, Jiva and Paramatma. Then the fifth question is, who is the enjoyer? Purusha. And the answer is, enjoyer is again the two Kshetragyas, the Jiva and the Paramatma. The Jiva is trying to enjoy the material nature and resulting in happiness and distress, and the Paramatma is the transcendental enjoyer, and he can be perceived through the various paths of karma, jnana, astang and bhakti. The sixth question is, what are the modes of material nature? And Krishna says that Prakriti is beginningless. It is the cause of all material causes and effects, and it manifests as the three modes. So these are the 6 questions and answers. Now, if you notice that these 6 questions actually have only 3 answers. They are repeating answers. So let's quickly look at the 3 answers that answer these 6 questions. So what are the 3 answers? If you look at the table, the first is the body. So this answers 2 of the question as to what is the Kshetra and what is Prakriti. So the field of activities in which the Jiva is sitting, the material body, it is composed of the modes of material nature. Right. So the answer to the first question is Kshetra and Prakriti. The second question, the second answer is, so to speak, the Jiva and the Paramatma. This answers actually 3 questions of Arjuna. So Arjuna has said that who is the Kshetragya? And Krishna says the Jiva and the Paramatma. The Jiva knows its own body, the Paramatma knows all the bodies, but they are both Kshetragyas. Then Arjuna has said, who is the game? What is the object of knowledge? And Krishna says the Jiva and the Paramatma. And then Arjuna asks, who is the enjoyer or the Purusha? And Krishna gives the same answer, Jiva and the Paramatma. Right? So we see that 3 questions are answered by this answer, Jiva and Paramatma. And the third question is, Arjuna asks, is what is Jnanam? What is knowledge? And Krishna answers that knowledge is understanding the difference between the body and the two, the Kshetra and the Kshetragyas. Right? So we see that essentially the 6 questions are answered by actually 3 answers. Okay, so this, like I said, ends the description of, or the answers of the 6 questions by Krishna. The last set of verses from 27 to 35 is essentially a summation of all that Krishna has spoken. So Krishna initially was doing question answer, but naturally the real reason that Krishna is speaking all this is for Arjun to get the real understanding of his own position and what to do to make spiritual advancements. So these last set of verses are based on Krishna's answers, but from a perspective of spiritual realization. Okay, so we'll do that in our next discussion. We'll stop over here. Srila Prabhupada ki Jai.